I've been a lawyer since 1964. Before that, lived in a small town in Iowa and was a pharmacist. Went to pharmacy college. I was a fourth generation pharmacist. Was in the Navy for 3 years. Had a drugstore with my family in a little town in Iowa for 5 years. Sold the store when I had 3 kids, and we went to law school. Went to law school at the University of Iowa. I was editor-in-chief of the Law Review and number 1 in the class, finally. And I had a good time in law school. When I got out of law school, it wasn't so much fun to be practicing law in the adversarial way. So that kind of brings me up to date that I have been practicing collaborative law since 1990. Collaborative law came about because I was very unhappy with my litigation practice. I hated my litigation practice. I hated to go to work in the morning. I have this image that I've shared with people that back in the old days when I was a kid, there were cowboy movies, and the cowboy used to come back to his shack in the evening, and he'd put a stick in the door with his hat on it to make sure no one shot at it before he went in the shack. And that was a feeling I had when I'd go to work in the morning, that something was you're gonna have some needs to crank up some affidavits or something you didn't expect to have happen, and all of a sudden you're gonna be into some furor. So I was just saying, I'm gonna get out of the practice of law. I was ready to quit. So I started taking some courses over at the U to see what some other profession. And then I thought, you know, if I'm willing to quit the practice of law, maybe there's some way to do it outrageously, that where I can do what I like to do and not do what I don't like to do, still practice law. So I started experimenting with that. I tried 2 or 3 different approaches that didn't work, and the closest thing was I had another compatriot. She was a lawyer that I got along with real well. We communicated real well, and I thought, you know, if clients would come to each of us, well, we could sit around a table and work it out. We had no agreement at that time about getting out of the case if it didn't settle. So we settled about a dozen cases that way, very successfully, very good feeling. Then we got that you always have that test case that shows up, the people that are your great teachers show up, and this couple was very amenable in the first session, and after this first session, something happened between sessions where they were all of a sudden fighting with each other, shouting at each other, tearing each other apart. And so the working around the table stopped working. The other lawyer and I didn't have sense enough to get out of the case because we didn't have any agreement on that. So we took that case to trial, and it was horrible. It was one of those cases where all the dirty tricks in the world show up. And you start thinking, is this the client or is this the other lawyer that's doing this? And we're trying to kind of sort that out, you know. And basically what it did was it destroyed our relationship, even though we didn't think anything would. We lost some of our trust level. And the great learning for me was, the aha moment for me, the epiphany was, if you're a settlement lawyer, you got to get out of the case if it doesn't settle and turn it over to the trial lawyers. And what came to mind then was the traditional English solicitor barrister model, where the solicitors work up the cases and the barristers try them. So the solicitors don't go to court, traditionally at least. So that was a tremendous moment for me where I said, aha, that's the way to do it. And on January 1 of 1990, I declared myself a collaborative lawyer. Now, there weren't any other ones. So that said, oh, I better find some other ones. So that started getting me involved with trying to enroll some other people locally in doing that. And what the remarkable thing was, people started hearing about this. People started, it's sort of like the tuning fork. You hit a tuning fork and it vibrates, and over here there's a tuning fork. They start vibrating when they get to the same frequency. And I think that's what happened with collaborative law, and it started spreading around country and well around the world. When I first started, I sent a letter to about a dozen lawyers that I thought might be interested and basically said, here's what I'm doing. You want to play the game? You know, there's no obligation. But if we find a case that sounds like it'll work, let's try it. And so about 4 responded from the dozen letters, and we started working it and doing some cases. And by the end of the year, we had about 9 people. And we started then meeting kind of more formally, getting together. And that's where I got the idea of having potlucks. So what's wonderful about a potluck is that the trial lawyer comes in with his casserole, you know, and everyone says, "Oh, I love that. What, does the guy have the recipe?" And it takes all the power out of it when people are sharing food in that way. It was just a wonderful thing to have happen, to see how that worked. Yeah. And of course, potlucks are big in Minnesota. Garrison Keillor endorses them. One of the, probably, I was part of somehow got involved with a group of lawyers, maybe a half a dozen lawyers from around the country, who would meet once a year, and they had some kind of a name for themselves, like creative lawyers or something, and something modest like that. And we'd sit there and talk about different ways of changing the practice of law. And they had heard about what I was doing, so they asked me to come and talk. So I just chatted around the table with them, you know. But that was sort of the first time it was sort of out of Minnesota. The second time it was out of Minnesota, I think, was in Santa Cruz, California. And again, it wasn't a training, it was just, can you come out and tell us what you're doing? So I met with about a dozen lawyers. And the amazing thing is that the lawyers that were there were Chip Rose, Nancy Ross, Peggy Thompson, and a number of about almost everyone that was involved at that particular time continued to be involved in some facet of collaborative law. You know, it was just amazing, and we just had a very inspiring day, just chatting about it. Yeah, and then very early on, I got a call from Pauline Tesler, and she had heard about it, and she had gotten it. You know, when I talked to her, there's no question in my mind that she had grasped it in the very deepest implications of it. And so we hit it off right away, and I sent her a whole gob of all the information I had. One of the great things about this movement is that we just share everything. And so yeah, that inspires other people to get involved. Interestingly enough, when we got very, very involved initially, we had a little board here, a collaborative board, and the board thought, so we got an inquiry from out east, and the board thought, well, we could share our material, but we should have a fee. And so we had a fee, and we never heard from them again. And that's what happens with fees and franchises and this kind of thing. If you've got a movement like this, you give it away, and it comes back and exponentially. Yes, that's what works.